I just went snooping on my mom's phone and I can't stop crying. I, 15F, was diagnosed with cancer back in 2021. At first, my cancer was in my uterus and it was very curable. After 6 months of chemotherapy, they decided to not remove my uterus because of how young I was. I then was finally cancer-free. Fast forward to 2 months later, my cancer came back. The tumor was so big, to the point that I aborted it. I started chemo again, a different one, and got full-on hysterectomy, plus 20 days of radiation. I was very optimistic and positive about the treatment working this time. I stopped chemo on May and was waiting on my scans. Scans results came back and come to find out my cancer developed in both my lungs and one of my breast. To say I've been devastated is an understatement. I've started my third chemo treatment recently. I did 2 rounds and did scans to see if it was working. Yesterday we got my results. My mom talked to the doctors privately and refused to tell me what they said. Today I checked her phone to confirm my suspicions. I read on her phone that my tumor's doubled in size, it has 2 mutations, there's no cure, and that I have few months to live. I've been crying ever since, she noticed, and we had a heart-to-heart conversation, and she reassured me that there's still treatment out there to make my situation better. I'm just so mad and sad at the same time. What's the saddest story you've ever heard? My mom was threatening divorce, and my dad was very depressed over it. For about a week, I went back and forth from the place my mom was staying and my home, where my dad was. I tried to make him feel better, and he kept asking me about my mom, asking me to talk to her, do anything I could to change her mind. I couldn't bring myself to tell him my mom had already made her decision. The night before Father's Day, I was leaving to spend the night with some friends. Before I left, I told him I'll be back early so I could make breakfast for him for Father's Day. He said he'll take a rain check. I didn't think anything of it. I went to a club that night and took some ecstasy. I was at the time also prescribed Adderall and was discreetly taking more than recommended. After an hour of feeling nothing, I began to feel lightheaded and hot. My heart started racing and I could barely think. I begged my friends to take me to the hospital, that something was happening to me. They shrugged it off. Finally, a boy I met that day, who was friends with one of my friends, drove me back to his house. The whole ride home, I was struggling to regulate my breath and heart rate, fearing for my life. When we got to his house, my body began to calm down, leaving me extremely weak and exhausted. I remember laying on his bed, still terrified of what and still could happen. His dog came up to me, jumped on the couch and curled up next to me, making it so his head propped on my leg, a melancholy look on his face. At about 6 a.m., all my friends were home, and after they begged forgiveness for not caring for me like they should have, I asked to be driven home. On the way, I randomly started tearing up, thinking I'll have to ask my dad to take me to the hospital. Something doesn't feel right. When we got to the house, I went to the door to see a note taped onto it. It basically said, "Don't go in the house and call the police. I'm sorry for being such a coward." My already weakened heart dropped. In shock, I called the police, eyes completely dry, that my dad had killed himself. I sat on the porch and cried. There was a lot of crying that day. My mom wailed when she drove up to the house, crying, "Oh my God, oh my God." I was taken to our neighbor's house and put to bed in the guest room. The rest of the day was spent alone, willing my body to survive. There were moments where I felt like it was going to shut down. I was too weak to cry. After a while, I realized it was Father's Day. When I was living in a third world country years ago, there was this guy about my age, I was 19 at the time, who was blind, and sometimes wandered the streets of my neighborhood selling brooms, which he carried in a bundle in his back. He didn't have a dog or anything, just a staff. I saw him walk by the house where we lived a few times, and I felt kind of sorry for him, but the first few times didn't really think much of it. What struck me about him, I suppose, was that he was my age. Normally, poor people on the streets are very old or very young, or maybe women with children. Here was a dude that looked otherwise healthy, yet was obviously quite destitute, but tried to make a living despite his disability. And believe me, it's quite different to live with a disability in a country like that than it is in France or the US. A few months after I had last seen him, I came home, and my mom was having a reunion with some of her lady expat friends as she did once a week. Tea and so on. I stopped by the solarium where they were, said hello to all, and proceeded to grab me a soda and a few pastries. While I was doing this, I picked up on the conversation they were having. It turns out that the day before, there had been a murder in a poor neighborhood that bordered ours. Not an unusual occurrence, but what stopped me was one of the ladies saying that they had killed a blind couple. I inquired further, and it turns out that it was this guy. The ladies knew him, of course, because they lived in the same area and I suppose even bought a broom or two from him at some point. Then it got worse. He lived in a little house with his wife, who was also blind. Apparently she worked doing needlepoint or something like that. Men, number unknown, had broken into their house at night, assaulted the guy. I mean, how could he defend himself? And while he was lying on the floor bleeding, raped his wife repeatedly. Then they stabbed her and kicked the guy's head in against the concrete floor of the house as they were leaving, killing him. She was still alive when they found her the next morning, but she died later. These were two disabled kids who had rallied against poverty and discrimination and tried to make it in the world on their own. They didn't deserve it. I think this has stuck with me over the years as something very sad because I always remembered seeing the guy walking slowly with his staff clicking on the pavement, yelling out brooms, brooms, and I wanted to come over and talk to him, ask him what his name was, if he had been born that way, and maybe help. Hell, maybe even buy a broom I didn't need. But I never did it. I could never shake the feeling that maybe I could have done something for him, and his wife, if I had known she existed, that maybe I could have prevented that from happening to them. Saddest story I heard came out of the Beslan school hostage crisis. Early in the siege, the terrorists had decided to let very small children go. One of the mothers who was there to see her daughter off to her first day of school had a 2-year-old. The three of them, 6-year-old daughter, the mother, and the 2-year-old walk forward to be released. They get to the edge of the school, and the terrorist there tells them that the mother and 2-year-old can leave, but the 6-year-old has to stay. The mother had to walk away as her daughter screamed for her to come back. The daughter survived.